When they cut into the 15-year-old king's chest, the smell made them step back. What surgeons found inside Edward VI wasn't just death. It was proof he'd been rotting alive for months. His lungs were destroyed, riddled with massive ulcers, completely putrefied from the inside out. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. The autopsy revealed something far worse than anyone suspected. Before I show you what they documented in those records, hit subscribe, because once you see what disease can really do to a human body, you'll understand why this death terrified an entire kingdom. This is the truth they found inside England's boy king. In the spring of 1552, 15-year-old King Edward VI seemed to have his entire life ahead of him. The son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, he'd ruled England since he was 9 years old. Intelligent, well-educated, and deeply devoted to his Protestant faith, Edward was finally growing into the monarch his father always dreamed he'd become. The sickly boy who'd survived a difficult childhood was maturing into a capable young king. Then April arrived, and with it came fever. It started like any other illness sweeping through Tudor England. Burning forehead, aching muscles, exhaustion that kept him confined to his chambers. Within days, angry red spots appeared across his skin. The royal physicians diagnosed measles, though some whispered it might be smallpox. Either way, the disease hit Edward hard. For weeks, he lay in his bedchamber at Westminster, attended by the finest doctors in the realm. They bled him. They prescribed herbs and potions. They prayed, and remarkably, it seemed to work. By summer, Edward had recovered. The fever broke. The rash faded. His strength slowly returned. He resumed his duties, attended council meetings, studied his lessons. To everyone at court, the crisis had passed. The young king had faced death and won. Relieved courtiers celebrated his resilience. His advisors breathed easier, no longer fearing a succession crisis. Edward himself threw himself back into governance with renewed energy, as if determined to prove the illness hadn't weakened him. But something had changed inside his body, something invisible, something no Tudor physician could detect or understand. Modern medicine now knows what happened that spring. Measles doesn't just attack the skin and cause fever. It invades the immune system itself, destroying the body's memory of how to fight disease. For years afterward, victims remained vulnerable to infections their bodies would have easily defeated before. In Edward's case, the illness had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. By autumn, Edward seemed perfectly healthy. He hunted. He debated theology with Protestant reformers. He worked on plans to reshape the English church. No one suspected anything was wrong. The court moved through its usual rhythmed ceremonies, feasts, political maneuvering. Winter came, and Edward celebrated Christmas with his usual solemnity, preferring religious observance to excessive celebration. December arrived cold and gray. London streets filled with merchants selling winter goods. Inside the palace, fires blazed in every hearth. Edward sat at his desk, reviewing documents, when he felt a tickle deep in his chest. He coughed once. Then again, it didn't stop. Within days, that small cough had grown persistent. Within weeks, it was constant. By January 1553, Edward VI was fighting for every breath, and the real horror was only beginning. January brought no relief. If anything, the cough grew worse with each passing day. What started as an irritation had become Edward's constant companion, a deep, rattling hack that shook his thin frame and left him gasping for air. The royal physicians gathered around his bed, exchanging worried glances they thought he couldn't see. Then came the morning Edward coughed into his handkerchief and saw color. At first, it was just phlegm thick and greenish yellow, the kind that comes with any chest infection. The doctors nodded knowingly, prescribed syrups of licorice and honey, assured him it would pass. But days turned into weeks, and the color changed. Streaks of darkness appeared in what he brought up. Not brown, Not red, black, as if something inside him was dying and staining everything it touched. Edward was intelligent enough to understand what the physicians wouldn't say. He'd read extensively, studied medicine as part of his education. He knew that coughing up black material meant decay deep in the lungs. He knew it meant the tissue itself was breaking down. And when those black streaks began mixing with bright red blood, he knew his body was destroying itself from within. The cough made everything impossible. He couldn't sleep more than an hour without waking, choking, desperately trying to clear his airways. He couldn't eat without triggering violent coughing fits that left food scattered across the table. He couldn't attend council meetings without interrupting proceedings with episodes so severe that grown men turned away, unable to watch their young king suffer. But the cough wasn't the only horror. His legs began to swell in late January. At first, just his ankles a slight puffiness his servants noticed when removing his stockings. Within days, the swelling had crept up his calves to his knees. The skin stretched tight and shiny, painful to touch. When physicians pressed their fingers into the flesh, the indentations remained, as if his body had lost the ability to hold its own shape. Soon, Edward couldn't stand without assistance. The weight of fluid in his legs made walking agonizing. His servants carried him from his bed to a chair, where he sat propped upright, because lying down made the breathlessness unbearable. When he tried to recline, the fluid in his lungs shifted, drowning him from the inside. He spent his nights half-sitting, pillows stacked behind him, fighting for each shallow breath. The physicians brought their instruments and their theories. They examined the colors in his sputum like scholars studying ancient texts. Greenish yellow suggested infection. Black meant putrefaction. Red meant bleeding. The combination was unusual, they murmured. They'd seen consumption before tuberculosis that wasted the body slowly, but this progression seemed different. Faster, more violent, more complete. Edward watched them debate. He was only 15, but he'd already lived long enough to recognize uncertainty masked as expertise. They didn't know what was happening to him. They couldn't stop it. And somewhere in those cold January nights, between coughing fits and gasping breaths, Edward VI realized he was going to die. Desperation makes people do dangerous things. By late February, the Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England, after the king himself had, watched Edward deteriorate for weeks. Every physician in London had examined the boy. Every remedy in their arsenal had failed. The king was dying, and with his death would come chaos. Edward had no direct heir. The succession was uncertain. England teetered on the edge of catastrophe. That's when Northumberland made a decision that would haunt history. Word had reached the court of an elderly woman who possessed knowledge of healing beyond what trained physicians understood. Some called her a cunning woman. Others whispered she dealt in darker arts. She lived outside London, away from official scrutiny, treating common folk with herbs and preparations the medical establishment dismissed as superstition. Normally, allowing such a person near the king would be unthinkable, but these weren't normal circumstances. Northumberland brought her to the palace in secret. No records document her name or where exactly she came from. What we know is that she arrived carrying bottles and pouches, promising relief where expensive doctors had delivered only failure. She examined Edward privately, studying his swollen legs, listening to his labored breathing, observing the colors in his sputum. Then she prepared her potions. What she gave him remains a mystery. Tudor medical records don't specify the ingredients. Witnesses mentioned foul-smelling liquids, powders dissolved in wine, compounds that had to be administered at specific times of day. Edward, desperate for any relief from the suffocating horror of his condition, took everything she offered. He had nothing left to lose. For a brief moment, there seemed to be hope. Edward reported feeling slightly stronger. The coughing fits came less frequently. Perhaps courtiers whispered the old woman had succeeded where university-trained physicians had failed. Perhaps she'd found some ancient remedy lost to modern medicine. Then everything got worse. Within days of taking her treatments, Edward's body began changing in new and terrifying ways. The swelling in his legs, already severe, was now joined by swelling in his head. His face puffed up, features distorting until he barely resembled himself. His feet swelled so grotesquely that no shoes would fit. The skin stretched so tight it looked ready to split open. New symptoms appeared that hadn't existed before. His stomach cramped violently after every dose of her medicine. He couldn't keep food down at all now, vomiting up everything he attempted to eat. His hair, once thick and golden brown like his father's, began coming out in clumps when servants tried to comb it. Strange pains shot through his extremities, burning sensations in his fingers and toes that made him cry out. Whispers spread through the palace like plague. Poison. The word appeared in private letters, in conversations behind closed doors, in the worried glances exchanged between servants. The symptoms Edward now displayed: the hair loss, the swelling, the violent stomach reactions matched descriptions of arsenic poisoning that any educated person would recognize. Had Northumberland's desperate gamble to save the king actually killed him? Had the old woman's cure been something far more sinister? Or had she simply given him toxic substances believing they would help, ignorant of the damage they would cause? The woman disappeared as quietly as she'd arrived, but the damage was done. Whatever she'd administered had accelerated Edward's decline. His body was now fighting battles on multiple fronts. The disease in his lungs and something new, something chemical, coursing through his blood. The desperate cure had become another form of death. Spring arrived, and with it came a brief, cruel illusion of hope. On May 7th, Councillor William Petter sat at his desk and wrote a letter that would soon prove tragically wrong. The king, he reported, was showing signs of improvement. Edward's fever had lessened. He'd managed to eat a small meal without immediately bringing it back up. The physicians spoke cautiously but optimistically about recovery. Perhaps the worst had passed. Perhaps the young king's body was finally winning its battle. 5 days later, everything changed. On May 12th, the royal physicians gathered for an emergency consultation. They'd conducted another examination of Edward, studying the progression of his symptoms with growing alarm. What they'd initially diagnosed as a recoverable chest infection had revealed itself as something far deadlier. They debated terminology, searching for words that would accurately convey the horror without causing panic. Finally, they settled on their official diagnosis: suppurating tumor of the lung. In modern terms, they'd identified a massive abscess, a pocket of infection that had formed deep in Edward's chest, filling with pus, growing larger with each passing day. The lung tissue around it was dying, rotting away while Edward still lived. The infection was releasing toxins into his bloodstream, poisoning him from within, and there was no cure, no treatment, no hope. The physicians delivered their verdict to the Privy Council in private. King Edward VI would not survive. It was no longer a question of if he would die, but when. Days? Weeks? Perhaps a month if he was strong enough to endure the agony. But death was now certain. The political implications hit the council like a thunderbolt. England's Protestant Reformation, still fragile and new, depended entirely on Edward's survival. His Catholic half-sister Mary was next in line. She would undo everything Edward had built, restore papal authority, reverse every religious reform. The country stood on the precipice of civil war, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But Edward himself faced something worse than politics. He faced the knowledge of his own approaching death. The fever that had briefly subsided now returned with savage intensity. It wasn't the kind that came and went with time of day. This was constant, relentless, burning through him day and night. His skin felt hot to the touch, yet he shivered beneath layers of blankets, teeth chattering uncontrollably. The fever fed on his remaining strength, consuming what little energy his wasted body still possessed. His cough, which had never truly stopped, now came with even greater violence. The effort of expelling infected material from his lungs left him exhausted and gasping. Between fits, he lay still, conserving energy for the next inevitable attack on his airways. And then came symptoms that marked the disease's spread beyond his chest. His belly began to distend, swelling outward as if something grew inside. Painful lumps appeared on his skin, ulcers breaking through from beneath, evidence that infection had entered his bloodstream and was now attacking his body everywhere. Each new ulcer was a small betrayal, his own flesh turning against him. Edward understood medical terminology well enough to know what suppurating tumor meant. He knew the physicians had given up. He knew time was running out. So he did the only thing left in his power. He began planning for England's future after his death, even if it meant defying the succession his father had established. The boy king had two enemies now, the disease eating his lungs, and the clock counting down his final days. There are diseases that kill quietly, hidden inside the body until the very end. Edward's illness was not one of them. By late May, what was happening inside his lungs had begun to manifest on the outside, transforming the young king into something that horrified everyone who saw him. The ulcers appeared first on his arms, small at first, like insect bites that wouldn't heal. But within days, they multiplied and spread. His chest, his back, his legs. Angry red eruptions that wept clear fluid and refused to close. Some grew larger, merging together into raw patches of exposed flesh. The physicians applied poultices and ointments, wrapped the worst areas in linen bandages, but nothing stopped the progression. The infection in his blood was forcing its way out through his skin. Edward's attendants changed his bedding multiple times each day, trying to keep him comfortable, trying to maintain some dignity for their dying king. But there was no hiding what was happening. The boy who once sat proudly on England's throne was being consumed by his own body's collapse. Then his hair started falling out. Not gradually, the way men lose hair with age. This was sudden and complete. When servants combed his hair each morning, whole clumps came away in the bristles. Golden brown strands that had framed his pale face now littered his pillow, his shoulders, the floor around his bed. Within weeks, large patches of his scalp showed through, pink and vulnerable. He'd inherited his father's coloring, his mother's delicate features, but now those features were being erased, stripped away by whatever poison or disease ravaged his system. His fingernails were next. They began lifting from the nail beds, loosening at the edges like leaves preparing to fall. The pain was constant, a throbbing ache in every fingertip. When attendants tried to trim them, the nails simply came away entirely, revealing tender pink flesh beneath. His toenails followed the same horrifying pattern. Soon, Edward couldn't bear even the weight of light blankets on his feet. The exposed skin was too sensitive, too raw. He could no longer move without assistance. The combination of weakness, swollen legs, and painful ulcers meant he remained in essentially the same position for hours, sometimes days. And immobility brought its own torture. Bed sores developed on his back, his hips, his heels, anywhere bone pressed against skin, pressed against mattress. These weren't the ulcers caused by infection spreading through his blood. These were pressure wounds, areas where his flesh was literally dying from being compressed too long in one position. His servants did everything they could. They placed cushions beneath him, shifted his weight carefully every few hours, treated the bed sores with salves. But there were too many wounds, too much damage, and far too little healthy tissue remaining to heal anything. The most terrible part wasn't the physical decay itself. It was watching Edward remain mentally sharp through all of it. His mind stayed clear even as his body fell apart. He understood what each new symptom meant. He saw the horror in his attendants' eyes when they dressed his wounds. He noticed when visitors made excuses to leave quickly, unable to stomach the sight of what he'd become. Courtiers who'd known Edward since childhood now struggled to recognize him. The thin but healthy boy who, been crowned at 9 years old, had transformed into something from a nightmare, hairless, covered in weeping sores, his skin hanging loose on a skeleton frame. Some who came to pay their respects left the chamber and wept. Others couldn't bring themselves to visit at all, sending letters instead, unable to witness the horror of a king being devoured alive. Edward VI was still breathing, still conscious, still aware. But the body that housed his mind was betraying him in every possible way, turning itself inside out, displaying its decay for all the world to see. On June 10th, the royal physicians made their final grim calculation. They'd been tracking Edward's decline with meticulous detail, measuring his pulse, observing his breathing rate, noting the color of his skin and the temperature of his fever. They'd seen enough dying patients to recognize the signs. After conferring privately, they delivered their verdict to the Privy Council. The king had 3 days left. Perhaps 4, if his young body proved more resilient than expected. But certainly no more than that. They were wrong. Edward would prove far more stubborn than anyone anticipated, but not in a way anyone would envy. June 11th brought a new and devastating development. Edward's stomach, which had struggled for months to process even simple foods, now rejected everything entirely. Not just solid food, everything. A spoonful of broth brought immediate retching. A piece of bread soaked in milk came back up within minutes. Even water seemed to trigger his body's refusal. His stomach had simply stopped functioning, unable to accept or process anything that entered it. This meant Edward was now starving to death on top of everything else. His already skeletal frame had no reserves left. Every ounce of fat had been consumed months ago. His muscles had wasted away to nothing. His body had been cannibalizing itself for weeks, breaking down tissue to find energy to keep his heart beating and his brain functioning. Without food, that process would accelerate until there was nothing left to burn. The physicians responded with the only option available: restoratives. These were concentrated liquid medicines, potent mixtures of herbs, minerals, and sometimes wine or spirits, designed to provide some basic sustenance and stimulation when eating was impossible. They were administered in tiny amounts, spoonfuls at a time, hoping Edward's ruined stomach might tolerate what it couldn't hold in larger quantities. It barely worked. Edward existed on these droplets of medicine, his body clinging to life through sheer biological stubbornness. Each spoonful was a negotiation, his attendants coaxing him to swallow, waiting anxiously to see if it would stay down. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. But it was enough to keep him alive, if what he was experiencing could truly be called living. And then there was the smell. Disease has an odor. Infection, decay, organs failing, they all produce distinctive scents that no amount of perfume or incense can fully mask. By mid-June, Edward's body was producing secretions with a stench that permeated his chambers. It came from the ulcers weeping on his skin. It came from his breath, tainted by the rotting tissue in his lungs. It came from bodily fluids his system could no longer properly process or eliminate. The smell was so overwhelming that attendants had to rotate frequently, stepping out for fresh air before returning to their duties. They burned sweet herbs constantly, opened windows despite Edward's complaints of cold, used scented cloths held to their faces. Nothing helped. The odor of death had settled into the room and wouldn't leave until Edward did. His body had lost the strength to perform even basic functions. Secretions built up in his lungs because he lacked the force to cough them out effectively. Fluids his system should have expelled simply accumulated, with nowhere to go, adding to the toxic burden his organs struggled to manage. Every bodily process was shutting down in sequence, each failure making the others worse. Edward drifted in and out of awareness, his consciousness ebbing with his strength. During lucid moments, he focused on the document that consumed his final days, his devise for the succession, the plan to bypass his Catholic sister Mary and place Lady Jane Grey on England's throne. Between sips of restorative medicines and waves of nausea, he refined the wording, made corrections, ensured his wishes would be clear. 3 days came and went. Edward lived on, but calling it life required a generous definition of the word. Edward had lived with fever for months. It had become as familiar as breathing, a constant low burn that never quite left his body. But what happened on June 15th was different. This wasn't the steady simmer he'd learned to endure. This was something violent and sudden, an inferno that attacked without warning. It struck in the early morning hours. One moment Edward was resting in his usual half-conscious state. The next his entire body was engulfed in heat so intense his attendants feared he was burning from the inside. His skin turned scarlet, radiating warmth that could be felt without touching him. Sweat poured from every inch of his body, soaking through his nightclothes and the linens beneath him within minutes. His attendants changed the bedding frantically, but fresh sheets were drenched almost immediately. This fever brought a new level of delirium. Edward's mind, which had remained remarkably clear through months of suffering, began to slip. He spoke to people who weren't there: his dead mother, Jane Seymour, his father, Henry VIII, siblings and advisers long absent from his chamber. His words came rapid and nonsensical, fragments of prayers mixed with political declarations, mixed with childhood memories. His eyes stared at things only he could see. The attack lasted 24 hours without breaking. No cooling cloths, no medicines, no prayers brought relief. The fever held him in its grip, burning through what little reserves his body still possessed. His heart raced, pounding frantically to circulate blood through tissues starved for oxygen. His pulse was so rapid physicians could barely count the beats, a hummingbird rhythm that could impossibly sustain itself. When the fever finally released him on June 16th, Edward collapsed into exhaustion, so profound he seemed more dead than alive. He didn't move. He barely breathed. His attendants checked repeatedly to ensure his heart still beat. Then, impossibly, it happened again. June 17th brought an exact repeat of the horror. Another violent fever. Another 24 hours of delirium and drenching sweats. Another day of his heart hammering uselessly, trying to deliver oxygen his destroyed lungs couldn't provide. This wasn't the pattern of normal illness, where fevers rise at night and break with dawn. This was sustained assault, his body trying and failing to fight an enemy that had already won. Between these attacks, Edward's pulse told a story physicians understood, but couldn't prevent. Each time they pressed fingers to his wrist or throat, they felt something weaker than before. The rhythm was erratic, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing to an alarming crawl. His heart was failing. After months of fighting to pump blood through a body that couldn't use oxygen properly, the muscle itself was giving out. The damage made perfect sense. When lungs can't transfer oxygen to blood efficiently, the heart compensates by working harder, beating faster, pumping more forcefully, trying through sheer effort to overcome the deficiency. For weeks or months, this strategy works. The heart muscles strengthen, enlarge, adapt to the increased demand. But eventually, the muscle exhausts itself. It stretches beyond its capacity. The chambers dilate, the walls thin, and then it begins to fail. Edward's labored breathing had been slowly killing his heart for half a year. Every gasping breath, every struggle for air, every night spent propped upright because lying flat meant drowning, all of it had placed impossible demands on an organ that couldn't rest, couldn't recover, couldn't repair itself while under constant siege. Now, in mid-June, that heart was losing its battle. The fevers were pushing it past its final limits, demanding performance it could no longer deliver. Edward's extremities grew cold despite the heat of his fever, his fingertips and toes turning pale and then faintly blue as circulation failed to reach them adequately. The physicians knew what this meant. When the heart begins to fail, the end comes quickly. And unlike the lungs, which could decay gradually over months, once the heart gave out, death would arrive within hours. Edward had survived 2 massive fever attacks. He wouldn't survive a third. Late June brought pain unlike anything Edward had experienced before. It started in his toes, a sensation he described to his physicians as fire under the skin. Not the dull ache of swelling or the rawness of ulcers, but something sharp and electric, as if his nerves themselves were being attacked. The pain came in waves, sometimes manageable, sometimes so intense he couldn't prevent himself from crying out. This was his kidneys failing. Though Tudor medicine couldn't make this connection, modern understanding reveals the truth. When kidneys stop filtering waste from blood, toxic compounds accumulate. These substances crystallize in joints and extremities, particularly the toes, causing excruciating pain. Edward's kidneys, damaged by months of infection and starved of proper blood flow, had joined his lungs and heart in collapse. The fluid retention that had plagued him since January now made terrible sense. Kidneys regulate the body's water balance, removing excess fluid through urine. When they fail, that fluid has nowhere to go. It pools in the lowest points, the legs, the ankles. Edward's lower limbs had become grotesque vessels filled with liquid his body couldn't process, stretched tight with fluid that added weight, but no strength, no function, only more suffering. His physicians could offer one mercy: opium. Derived from poppy plants, opiate medicines had been used for centuries to ease unbearable pain. They prepared tinctures and gave them to Edward in measured doses, carefully balanced to provide relief without rendering him completely unconscious. He needed to remain aware. There was still work to finish. The medicine helped, but only briefly. An hour, perhaps two, of dulled sensation, of pain pushed to the edges of consciousness rather than dominating it completely. Then the effects would fade, and the fire in his toes would return. The pressure in his legs would reassert itself. The suffocating tightness in his chest would demand attention. And Edward would endure until the next dose, counting minutes until he could have relief again. What made these final days particularly cruel was Edward's mental clarity. Some dying patients slip into unconsciousness, their minds mercifully shutting down before their bodies finish failing. Edward had no such escape. He remained aware, observant, able to understand exactly what was happening to him. He knew every new symptom meant another organ surrendering. He recognized the looks exchanged between his attendants when they thought he wasn't watching. He understood that time was measured now in days, perhaps hours. So he focused on what he could control: England's future. His devise for the succession required final revisions. Letters needed to be written, instructions given, arrangements made. Between doses of opiate medicine, during those brief windows when pain receded enough to think clearly, Edward worked. His handwriting, once elegant, had deteriorated to barely legible scrawls. His hand shook from weakness and damaged nerves. But he persisted. Visitors came to say farewell, though Edward often seemed more concerned with politics than sentiment. He discussed the succession with advisers, dictated messages to be delivered after his death, ensured his Protestant reforms would be protected. Even dying, even suffering tortures that would have broken most adults, the 15-year-old king tried to control what would happen when he could no longer control anything. The opium brought strange dreams during moments of rest. He saw himself healthy again, running through palace gardens as he had as a child. He saw his mother, who died giving birth to him, welcoming him. He saw England transformed by his reforms, a Protestant nation secure in its faith. But he always woke to reality: the pain, the breathlessness, the smell of his own decay, and the knowledge that death was coming, whether he was ready or not. July 6th began like every recent morning, with Edward struggling to breathe. But something was different this day. His attendants felt it immediately when they entered his chamber at Greenwich Palace. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an inevitability that had been building for months. Edward's breathing had changed overnight, becoming shallower, more irregular, as if his body was finally surrendering the fight it had waged for so long. He'd been moved to Greenwich in late June, carried carefully from Westminster in a litter. The journey had exhausted him, but his advisers insisted. Greenwich had better air than London, or so they claimed. In truth, it made little difference where Edward died. His fate had been sealed weeks ago, but Greenwich offered privacy, distance from the crowds and rumors swirling through the capital. Here, England's boy king could die away from too many watching eyes. Throughout the morning, Edward drifted between consciousness and something deeper. His lips moved constantly, forming words that attendants had to lean close to hear. Prayers, mostly. Fragments of scripture he'd memorized as a child. Occasional instructions about documents, about succession, about England. Even in these final hours, duty pressed on his mind. By afternoon, it was clear the end had arrived. Counselors gathered outside his chamber, their presence a death watch that needed no announcement. Inside, only his closest attendants remained, the men and women who'd cared for him through the worst of his suffering, who'd changed his dressings and held cups of medicine to his cracked lips and pretended not to notice when tears ran down his wasted face. Edward's breathing grew more labored as the day progressed. Each inhalation was a conscious effort now, his chest rising barely at all, his destroyed lungs unable to expand properly. The infection that had consumed them had left almost nothing functional. For months, he'd been suffocating by degrees. Now, in these final hours, the suffocation was nearly complete. Around 8 in the evening, Edward spoke his last coherent words. His voice was barely a whisper, but the attendant closest to him heard clearly enough. "I am faint," Edward said, each word an effort. He paused, gathering what remained of his strength. "Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." It was a prayer he'd known since childhood, a simple plea for the mercy his body had been denied. He closed his eyes after speaking, his breathing becoming even more shallow, more irregular. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. His chest would rise slightly, pause for what seemed an impossibly long time, then fall. Rise again. Pause. Fall. And then it didn't rise anymore. King Edward VI died as the sun set on July 6, 1553. He was 15 years old, 6 months and 8 days. He'd reigned for 6 years and 5 months. And he spent the last 6 months of his life experiencing horrors that most people couldn't imagine enduring for 6 days. The room fell silent. Attendants who'd kept vigil through so many terrible nights now stood frozen, unable to quite believe it was over. Someone began to weep quietly. Someone else dropped to their knees in prayer. Outside the chamber, word spread quickly through Greenwich Palace: the king was dead. Within minutes, a rider was dispatched to London to carry the news. Within hours, the political machinery Edward had tried so carefully to control would begin moving, often in directions he'd never intended. Within days, his carefully planned succession would unravel completely. But in that moment, in that quiet chamber at Greenwich, none of that mattered. Edward's suffering had finally ended, and for the first time in months, his face showed something resembling peace. A surgeon was summoned immediately. There would need to be an examination, an official determination of death's cause. It was required by law and by custom. What they would find when they opened his body would shock even these men who watched him die slowly. The external decay had been horrifying enough, but the truth hidden inside Edward's chest was far worse than anyone suspected. The surgeon arrived at Greenwich Palace within the hour. His name has been lost to history, but his task was clear and legally mandated. Determine the precise cause of King Edward VI's death. In Tudor England, royal deaths required official examination and documentation. Questions of succession, inheritance, and potential foul play all demanded answers that only an autopsy could provide. He entered the chamber where Edward's body had been prepared. The attendants had cleaned the king as best they could, washing away the evidence of his final moments, dressing him in fresh linens. But they couldn't disguise what months of disease had done. The corpse on the table barely looked human skeletal. covered in partially healed ulcers, hairless, the skin hanging loose on bones, with almost no flesh between. The surgeon laid out his instruments with practiced efficiency. A sharp knife for the initial incision, smaller blades for more delicate work, clamps to hold tissue aside. This wasn't his first autopsy, though it was certainly his first of a king. He'd examined plague victims, accident casualties, executed criminals. He knew what death looked like, what disease could do to human tissue. Nothing had prepared him for what waited inside Edward VI. The first cut ran from throat to belly, a long vertical incision that opened the torso. Standard procedure. The surgeon worked carefully, methodically, aware that his findings would be scrutinized by physicians, counselors, and possibly historians. He needed to be thorough and accurate. Then he reached the rib cage and began cutting through the bone to access the chest cavity. The smell hit him immediately. A wave of putrefaction, so intense he had to step back. He'd encountered the stench of decay countless times in his career, but this was different. This wasn't the smell of a body that had been dead for days. This was the smell of tissue that had been rotting while its owner still lived. The odor was sweet and foul simultaneously, thick enough to taste, aggressive enough to make his eyes water. He pressed a scented cloth to his face and returned to his work, forcing himself to continue despite his body's instinct to retreat. The other men in the room, physicians who'd attended Edward during his illness, officials there to witness and record the findings, backed toward the walls, handkerchiefs covering their noses and mouths. One rushed from the chamber entirely, unable to stomach what his senses were reporting. The surgeon spread the ribcage open, revealing the chest cavity and the organs within. What he saw there would be recorded in official documents, preserved in medical writings, studied and referenced for centuries. Because the damage inside Edward's chest wasn't just severe, it was absolute. Where healthy lungs should have been pink and spongy, resilient tissue designed to expand and contract with each breath, there was instead something that barely resembled organs at all. Both lungs had transformed into masses of diseased tissue, their normal architecture destroyed completely. The surgeon could see immediately why Edward had struggled to breathe for months. There was almost nothing left, capable of transferring oxygen to blood. But the most striking finding, the detail that would be emphasized in every official report, was the presence of two enormous ulcers. These weren't small areas of damage. They were massive, described in the autopsy records as great, a term that conveyed both their unusual size and the horror they represented. Each ulcer was a cavity where lung tissue had been eaten away entirely, leaving behind pockets filled with thick, purulent fluid. The surgeon carefully examined each lung, documenting what he found. The texture was wrong, soft, and fragile, where it should have been firm, crumbling at the slightest pressure. The color was wrong, mottled browns and grays and blacks instead of healthy pink. Even the weight was wrong, heavy, with accumulated fluid and infection, rather than light and air-filled. This was putrefaction, complete and utter decay of tissue that had somehow sustained life for months, even as it rotted from within. The surgeon had his answer to what killed King Edward VI. The question now was how anyone had survived this level of damage for as long as Edward had. The surgeon continued his examination, probing deeper into the damaged tissue. What he discovered went far beyond the two massive ulcers that had first caught his attention. The entire internal structure of Edward's lungs had been systematically destroyed, eaten away by infection that had spread through every airway, every blood vessel, every microscopic air sac designed to sustain life. When he cut into the lung tissue itself, the blade revealed something that shouldn't exist in living organs: cavitations. These were hollow spaces where tissue had simply ceased to exist, dissolved by the infection's relentless assault. Some were small, the size of peas. Others were large enough to fit a man's thumb. They riddled both lungs like wormholes in rotted wood, creating a Swiss cheese architecture that explained why Edward had drowned on dry land for months. Each cavity had been an active battlefield. The infection would attack healthy tissue, killing cells, liquefying them into pus. Edward's immune system would try to wall off the damage, forming barriers of scar tissue. But the infection would breach those barriers, spread to adjacent areas, create new cavities. The process had repeated hundreds of times, gradually converting functional lungs into useless masses of dead and dying tissue. The surgeon pressed gently on one section of lung, and thick fluid oozed from the cut surface. Not blood, this was pus, dense and yellow-green, the color of advanced infection. It had the consistency of curdled cream, far thicker than any normal bodily fluid. This was the material Edward had been coughing up for months, the greenish-yellow sputum that had signaled to physicians that something was terribly wrong. Except what came up in his coughing fits had been only a fraction of what accumulated inside. Most had stayed trapped, building up in cavities and airways, providing perfect breeding grounds for more infection. The airways themselves, the branching tubes that should carry air deep into lung tissue, were severely compromised. Where they should have been open passages, they were narrowed to slits by inflammation and scar tissue. Some were completely blocked by accumulated secretions that Edward's weakened cough could never dislodge. The surgeon could trace these narrowed passages with his instruments, feeling how constricted they'd become, understanding viscerally why every breath had been such desperate labor for the dying king. In the lower portions of both lungs, the surgeon found something else, fluid that wasn't pus. This was thinner, clearer, tinged slightly pink with blood. Pneumonia had developed on top of the tuberculosis, filling air spaces with liquid that prevented any remaining functional tissue from working properly. Edward's final weeks had involved drowning in multiple ways, simultaneously pus from the ulcers, fluid from pneumonia, and blood from vessels damaged by coughing. The surgeon made careful notes, describing what he found in terms other physicians would understand. He documented the locations of the largest cavities, estimated the volume of infected material, observed how the disease had affected different regions of each lung. This wasn't just medical curiosity. These details would become part of the official record, evidence for why England's king had died at 15. What struck him most, reviewing the totality of damage, was the impossibility of survival. These lungs couldn't have supported life. The amount of functional tissue remaining was negligible, perhaps 10 or 15% of what a healthy person possessed. Yet Edward had lived for months in this condition, his body somehow extracting just enough oxygen from each labored breath to keep his brain and heart functioning. It was, in its own terrible way, remarkable. Most patients with this level of lung destruction would have died within weeks. Edward had endured for half a year, conscious and aware, experiencing every moment of suffocation. The human body's capacity to cling to life, even life filled with agony, was both extraordinary and cruel. The surgeon's examination couldn't stop at the lungs. To provide a complete account of the king's death, he needed to inspect every major organ, document every abnormality. What he found as he continued his work revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone had suspected. The disease hadn't been confined to Edward's chest. It had traveled through his bloodstream, establishing colonies of infection throughout his entire body. The liver came next in the examination. In a healthy person, this organ is smooth, firm, a deep reddish-brown color. Edward's liver was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, its surface mottled with pale patches that indicated areas of damage. When the surgeon cut into it, the texture was wrong softer than it should be, with regions that had begun to break down. Secondary infection had taken hold here, the liver struggling to filter toxins from blood, while simultaneously being poisoned by bacteria that had spread from the lungs. This explained some of Edward's symptoms in those final weeks. The yellowing tinge to his skin that attendants had noticed, the way his belly had swelled despite his body wasting away elsewhere. His liver had been failing, unable to perform the hundreds of chemical processes that keep a body functioning. Waste products that should have been neutralized and eliminated were instead accumulating, adding to the toxic burden that made every day more unbearable. Moving lower in the abdomen, the surgeon examined the intestines. He found ulceration here, two raw patches where the intestinal lining had been eaten away, creating openings that allowed digestive contents to leak into surrounding tissue. These ulcers explained Edward's inability to keep food down in his final month, the cramping pain that came with every attempt to eat. His digestive system had become another battlefield, another front in a war his body was losing on every level. The kidneys showed their own story of failure. Normally dark red and firm, Edward's kidneys were pale, their surfaces scarred with patches of dead tissue. They'd been starved of proper blood flow for months as his heart struggled and his blood pressure dropped. Without adequate circulation, kidney cells had died in clusters, leaving behind regions that could no longer filter waste or regulate fluid balance. This was why Edward's legs had swelled so grotesquely, why fluid had accumulated throughout his body with nowhere to go. The surgeon lifted the spleen and immediately noted its enlarged size. This organ, part of the immune system, had been working overtime for months, trying to fight an infection it could never overcome. It had swollen with the effort, packed with immune cells mobilized again and again in futile attempts to stop the tuberculosis from spreading. The enlargement was evidence of a biological war that had raged inside Edward's body since that first persistent cough appeared in January. What became clear as the surgeon completed his examination was that Edward hadn't died from lung disease alone. He'd died from systemic collapse, every major organ compromised, every vital system pushed beyond its capacity to function. The tuberculosis had started in his lungs, yes, but it hadn't stayed there. It had used his bloodstream as a highway, sending infectious particles to seed new sites of disease throughout his body. The infection had been everywhere, in his lungs, his liver, his intestines, his kidneys. And as the surgeon would note in his final observations, almost certainly in his brain as well, though examining that organ in detail would have required more extensive dissection than time or propriety allowed. Edward Veigh hadn't just been eaten alive from the inside. He'd been consumed completely, every part of him under attack, until there was simply nothing left capable of sustaining life. The Tudor surgeon who examined Edward's body in 1553 documented what he saw with meticulous accuracy, but he couldn't fully understand what he was looking at. Medical science at the time lacked the knowledge to interpret the constellation of symptoms and physical findings. They knew Edward had died from diseased lungs, from ulcers and putrefaction. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing one of history's most thoroughly documented cases of disseminated tuberculosis. Modern medical analysis of the historical autopsy records reveals the complete picture. Edward didn't just have tuberculosis confined to his lungs. He had miliary tuberculosis, a form where the infection spreads through the bloodstream to multiple organs simultaneously. The name comes from the Latin word for millet seed, because the bacterial colonies that form throughout the body resemble tiny grain seeds scattered everywhere. In Edward's case, those seeds had grown into full-blown infections in virtually every organ system. This explains the bewildering array of symptoms that plagued his final months. The lung symptoms made sense. That's where tuberculosis typically starts. But the swollen legs, the ulcers erupting through his skin, the inability to digest food, the excruciating pain in his toes, these weren't separate diseases. They were all manifestations of the same infection, attacking different parts of his body simultaneously. The most significant finding that Tudor physicians missed entirely was what had happened to Edward's brain. Modern analysis of his symptoms in those final weeks, the confusion during fever attacks, the severe headaches he complained of, the delirium that overtook him repeatedly, points clearly to tubercular meningitis. The infection had reached the membranes surrounding his brain and spinal cord, causing inflammation that affected his mental state and neurological function. This brain involvement explains moments that witnesses found disturbing but couldn't interpret. Edward's periods of speaking to people who weren't there, weren't just fever dreams. They were symptoms of an infection attacking the very tissue that housed his consciousness. The bacteria had crossed the blood-brain barrier, establishing themselves in one of the body's most protected spaces, and from there they'd launched an assault on the organ that made Edward who he was. Tubercular meningitis also explains why his headaches were so severe in those final weeks, worse than the usual discomfort of fever. The inflammation around his brain created pressure inside his skull, a pain that no amount of opiate medicine could fully relieve. Every heartbeat sent waves of agony through his head as inflamed tissue pressed against bone with nowhere to expand. Looking at the complete medical picture, modern physicians can trace the infection's journey through Edward's body. It started in his lungs after the measles weakened his immune system. For months, it grew there, establishing the massive ulcers the autopsy revealed. Then, as the infection overwhelmed local defenses, bacteria entered his bloodstream. From there, they traveled everywhere, to his liver, his kidneys, his intestines, his spleen, his skin, his brain. Each organ became a new battlefield, each system another casualty, in a war that Edward's body had no ability to win. No treatment existed in 1553 that could have saved him. Even with modern antibiotics, disseminated tuberculosis with brain involvement is difficult to cure. In Edward's time, with nothing but herbs and prayers and potions, death wasn't just inevitable, it was merciful. It ended suffering that no human being should have to endure. Even with modern medical understanding confirming disseminated tuberculosis as the primary cause of death, one question has never been fully answered. Was Edward also poisoned? The autopsy findings and tuberculosis diagnosis explain most of what happened to him, but not everything. And those unexplained details have fueled centuries of speculation about whether someone deliberately hastened his death. The symptoms that don't quite fit are impossible to ignore. Hair falling out in clumps and fingernails loosening from their beds can occur with severe illness and malnutrition, yes. But they're also classic signs of arsenic poisoning. The timing is particularly suspicious. These symptoms appeared suddenly after the mysterious woman administered her treatments in late February. Before her visit, Edward was deteriorating from lung disease. After her visit, his body began exhibiting new and different forms of destruction. Arsenic was everywhere in Tudor medicine. Physicians used it regularly, believing small doses could cure everything from plague to syphilis. Arsenic compounds appeared in skin treatments, digestive remedies, and tonics meant to restore vitality. The line between medicine and poison was dangerously thin, and many treatments that were supposed to heal instead killed. The woman who treated Edward almost certainly used arsenic in her preparations. The question is whether the dose was therapeutic or lethal. Some historians point to political motives. The Duke of Northumberland had everything to gain from Edward's death, provided it happened after the king signed documents naming Lady Jane Grey as his successor instead of Catholic Mary. If Edward had recovered or lingered too long without signing, Northumberland's entire plan would collapse. A subtle poison that accelerated an existing illness would be nearly impossible to detect among all the other symptoms Edward was experiencing. But there's another possibility that's less sinister, but equally deadly. The cure itself was toxic. Many substances Tudor healers believed were beneficial mercury, lead, antimony, arsenic are now known to be poisonous. The woman may have genuinely tried to save Edward using remedies she believed were powerful medicine. She may have given him exactly what she'd successfully given other patients. The difference was that Edward's body, already devastated by tuberculosis, had no reserves left to survive toxic side effects that a healthier person might have weathered. The violent stomach reactions, the intensified swelling, the burning sensations in his extremities, these could be arsenic poisoning layered on top of tuberculosis. Or they could be the tuberculosis itself, reaching new organs and causing new symptoms. Medical historians remain divided. The autopsy evidence shows overwhelming tuberculosis, but that doesn't exclude the possibility that toxic medicines made everything worse. What's certain is that whatever the old woman gave Edward didn't help. Whether it was poison disguised as cure, or cure that acted as poison, the result was the same. Edward's suffering intensified, his decline accelerated, and his death became even more inevitable than it already was. The truth likely lies somewhere uncomfortable. Edward was dying from tuberculosis, but the attempts to save him, whether motivated by genuine healing intent or political calculation, poisoned him further. He was being consumed from the inside by disease, and possibly being poisoned from the outside by medicine. His body became a battlefield where infection and toxins competed to see which would kill him first. In the end, does it matter whether arsenic hastened his death by days or weeks? Edward was doomed the moment tuberculosis spread beyond his lungs. The poison question, if there was poison, is whether he died slightly faster in slightly greater agony. Either way, what happened inside his body remains one of the most horrifying medical cases in royal history. When modern medical experts examine Edward VI's case, they use a phrase that perfectly captures the horror of what happened to him. He was eaten alive from the inside. It's not metaphor. It's clinical accuracy. The tuberculosis bacteria that infected his body after measles weakened his immune system, quite literally consumed him, breaking down healthy tissue and converting it into diseased material organ by organ, system by system, over the course of 6 agonizing months. The mechanism of his death was suffocation, but in the slowest, most complete way possible. Healthy lungs transfer oxygen from air into blood with remarkable efficiency. Edward's destroyed lungs could barely perform this function at all. With each breath, only a fraction of the oxygen his body needed made it into his bloodstream. His cells were constantly starving for oxygen, unable to produce energy properly, beginning to die in clusters throughout his body. This oxygen starvation affected everything. His brain, deprived of adequate fuel, struggled to maintain clear thought and eventually began showing signs of damage through confusion and delirium. His heart, forced to work overtime trying to compensate for inadequate oxygen delivery, gradually wore itself out until it could no longer maintain proper circulation. His muscles, unable to generate energy efficiently, wasted away to nothing. Every cell in his body was slowly suffocating, even while he continued breathing. But suffocation wasn't the only way tuberculosis was killing him. The infection itself was producing toxins that poisoned his system continuously. As bacteria broke down tissue in his lungs and other organs, they released waste products into his blood. His liver tried desperately to neutralize these toxins, but was itself infected and failing. His kidneys attempted to filter the waste, but were damaged and overwhelmed. The result was a steady buildup of poisonous compounds that made him feel increasingly sick, even beyond the breathing difficulty. Starvation added another layer to his death. The infection consumed enormous amounts of energy-fighting disease, burns calories at an accelerated rate. Meanwhile, his damaged digestive system couldn't process food properly, and eventually couldn't keep anything down at all. His body had no choice but to cannibalize itself, breaking down muscle tissue and fat stores to keep vital organs functioning. By the end, there was nothing left to burn. He was quite literally starving to death, while simultaneously suffocating and being poisoned by infection. The combination of contributing factors made Edward's death exceptional, even among tuberculosis cases. Most patients with pulmonary tuberculosis die when the lung damage reaches a critical threshold. They simply can't breathe anymore, and death comes relatively quickly. Edward survived far longer because he was young and had been healthy before the illness struck. His body clung to life with desperate tenacity, finding ways to function on impossibly small amounts of oxygen, somehow maintaining consciousness through conditions that should have killed him weeks earlier. This made his death more horrible, not less. A quicker death would have been mercy. Instead, Edward experienced every stage of systemic collapse in full awareness. He felt his body failing piece by piece. He understood what each new symptom meant. He knew he was dying, and could do nothing but endure while it happened with agonizing slowness. No treatment available in 1553 could have changed this outcome. Even the best physicians of the age were powerless against disseminated tuberculosis. All they could do was watch, document, and eventually cut open his body to confirm what they suspected. That disease had destroyed their king from the inside out. Edward VI's death became one of the most thoroughly documented royal deaths in English history, but not because of ceremony or political significance. It was documented because witnesses couldn't stop talking about what they'd seen. The sheer horror of watching a 15-year-old boy be destroyed so completely by disease. Letters written in the weeks after his death described the ordeal in graphic detail, preserving accounts that would normally have been considered too disturbing to record. The autopsy findings confirmed what everyone who attended Edward already knew. His death had been unspeakable agony. The surgeon's report left no room for euphemism or gentle interpretation. The lungs were putrefied. The ulcers were massive. Multiple organs had failed. The medical evidence matched perfectly with the months of visible suffering, the breathlessness, the coughing fits, the swelling, the ulcers, the hair loss, the pain. Every symptom had been real, and every symptom had pointed to the systematic destruction the autopsy revealed. Nature itself seemed to mark Edward's passing. Contemporary accounts describe a violent thunderstorm that struck on the day of his death. Witnesses reported hailstones falling that were tinged red, described in letters as looking like clotted blood. Whether this was atmospheric phenomenon, trick of light, or exaggeration born from grief and shock, the image captured something essential about how Edward's death felt to those who witnessed it, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. His burial happened quickly, far faster than typical royal funerals required. Official explanations cited the need for proper ceremony preparations, but rumors suggested other motives. Some whispered that authorities wanted the body interred before more questions could be asked. Others claimed the condition of the corpse made extended viewing impossible, that despite the embalmer's best efforts, the decay continued. Whether these rumors held truth or were simply manifestations of the paranoia that gripped England during the succession crisis, Edward was in his tomb within weeks. That tomb in Westminster Abbey would later be opened and examined, but by then only bones remained, offering no additional answers to the questions that haunted his death. The soft tissue that had told such a horrific story in the autopsy was long gone, leaving only the skeleton of a boy who should have lived decades longer. What remains is the truth preserved in those autopsy records and witness accounts documentation that survives, because people needed to record what they'd seen, needed to make sense of suffering that seemed beyond comprehension. Edward's death wasn't unique because he was a king. It was unique because every stage was observed and documented by educated men who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary in its horror. He didn't die from poison alone, though poison may have hastened the end. He didn't die from simple tuberculosis, though that was the root cause. Edward VI died from total systemic collapse, every organ attacked, every system failing. His body consumed piece by piece, while his mind remained clear enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. It was a death far more horrible than assassination, more terrible than any quick execution. It was the slow murder committed by disease itself, documented in clinical detail, preserved in history as a reminder of what human suffering looked like before modern medicine could offer even the smallest mercy.